Hello, my name is Jenny Thorvaldson. I am the Chief Economist and Director of Data Development for InPlan. And today I'd like to talk to you about multipliers, a concept that is fundamental to doing economic impact analysis with an input-output model such as InPlan. So let me go ahead and share my screen and start the presentation, in which we're going to talk about the definitions, the definition of multipliers, the different types and uses, some very important considerations when using multipliers and interpreting multipliers. And then finally, I'll end by showing you where to find multipliers within InPlan. So first off, what are multipliers? Most of you are probably familiar with the concept of a multiplier effect or multipliers. And it's basically what you would probably intuitively think it is. It basically represents the extra economic activity, whether in terms of output, employment, value added, or any of the components of value added, that is generated throughout the regional economy for every unit of direct economic activity, be it from an industry, institution, or project. So there are a lot of words in there. I'm going to point out a few things in particular. So one, as I mentioned, there are different types of multipliers, and you can look at employment multipliers, output multipliers, value-added multipliers, really depending on what particular type of economic activity is of most importance to you. So a lot of people are very interested in employment multipliers, but there's all different kinds that we can look at, and we'll show some of that as we go through this. Another thing I wanted to point out is that I used the term regional economy. That really is defined by the analyst and their audience and what is of most importance to them. So for example, it could be a cluster of zip codes that represents a city, or it could be a county or a cluster of counties that represents an MSA. Or you might be most interested in the state if there are some statewide impacts that are expected or that did occur. And you could even look at the nation as a whole. So when I use the word economy or regional economy, I'm not referring to any specific size of economy. It's really whichever one that, whatever economy is of interest to you as the analyst. And then I also have here for every unit of direct economic activity of an industry, institution, or project. You could be looking at an industry as a whole. What is the multiplier effect of agriculture? Or you could even go more specific industry, grain farming. Or you could be looking at a specific institution like government spending and what is the multiplier effect of it, or household spending. Or you could be looking at a specific project like the construction of a bridge or a dam or something like that. So all kinds of flavors of multipliers. Another way to state it then is that multiplier effect refers to the total effect of an economic change relative to the initial effect after all the associated ripple effects or secondary effects have worked their way through the economy. So basically, the multiplier is the total effect divided by the direct effect. Okay, and as I mentioned, these multipliers can be measured in terms of employment, output, GDP, which is also known as value added, or any of the four components of GDP, the most common of which of interest is labor income. Now, technically, multipliers are unitless, and that's because the numerator and the denominator are in the same units. And so dividing one by the other, the units cancel out. So for example, total jobs per direct job, or total labor income per direct labor income. So a concrete example would be a new 100-employee car manufacturing plant comes to a county, and you do an InPlan study on that. It's estimated to have a total employment impact throughout all the industries in that economy of 150 jobs. So then, in this case, the employment multiplier is 1.5 because 150 is the total impact divided by 100, which was your initial impact, yields 1.5. The interpretation of this is that for each direct job at this plant, another 0.5 jobs in the wider economy are supported. And those could be jobs in other industries or service sectors in the economy, or even the same industry, but at a different company, because you might be buying some parts or some service from some other company in the auto manufacturing sector. Okay. So as I mentioned, as we saw in the previous slide, the multiplier is the total effect divided by the direct effect. The direct effect is the initial change or value being analyzed. So it could be the current output of agriculture in a region, or it could be a change like this new car manufacturing plant locating in a region. It can also be a negative change, mind you, the closing of a plant or something like that, or if population is changing and the number of households in a region is decreasing, you might want to look at the negative wider economic impact of a decrease in household spending, or something related to a pandemic and there's reduced household spending. There's some negative economic impacts associated with that. So whatever really you're analyzing, that's your direct effect. And then you use the model in these multipliers to give you the total effect. And so the total effect is your direct effect plus what we're calling the ripple effects or the secondary effects. And they are of two different types. There's indirect effects and induced effects. So what are these two types of secondary effects? The indirect effects capture the inter-industry effects. So local industries purchasing from other local industries. Okay, and induced effects capture the local spending of labor income after removing savings, payroll and income taxes, and commuters. Okay, so these, just to describe these a little more. So indirect effects is basically that in our example of a new car manufacturing plant, that car manufacturing plant is going to need to buy inputs. And those can be physical inputs like tires and windshields and paint and water and whatever else it takes to put together to assemble a car. And some of those may be available from other local industries. So there may, and InPlan has data on this, whether or not there's a local tire manufacturing plant in that region, and has estimates on, if there are those local, how much of those tires will be purchased locally or not. It doesn't assume just because there's a local tire manufacturer in the region that all of the tires for this car manufacturing plant come from that tire manufacturer. There's a whole trade model that goes in, that is involved in this. So won't go into that today, but basically it's the buying of inputs, and not just physical inputs, but also services. So they might purchase some accounting services from a local accounting firm, some law services they might have as well, and some of that might be purchased locally. So indirect effects are industries buying from other industries. Okay, and induced effects are basically the workers at that car manufacturing plant, those 100 workers, they go out and spend money on some of their money after accounting for savings and taxes and employees that don't live in the region. Those who do then will spend some of their money at local restaurants, local movie theaters, local grocery stores, local salons and barber shops, and local clothing stores, and all of those things. But we do take it, we don't assume that all this stuff is purchased locally. Again, we've got our trade flow model that helps us with that. One other thing to keep in mind is that a local purchase isn't the same as local production. So for example, if there's some of these local employees go to the local Walmart or Target and they buy clothing there, it's very unlikely, and we have data on whether or not that clothing is manufactured in the region, and it's probably not. There's very little of that in the US, especially at the county level. But there will be some money that stays in the region because some of the money is kept by Walmart or Target or whatever the store is, the local mom and pop store. So even though the manufacturing may not happen there, a portion of that purchase amount does stay at that store, that retail markup or retail margin that they do get to keep. But all of that information is in plan, and it's all taken care of for you. And that's all of that, all of those leakages and local production or not, all of that is wrapped up into this multiplier effect. Okay, one other thing to point out is a lot of people are interested in what we at InPlan call a response coefficient. And in fact, that's what the US Forest Service calls it as well. And it's something they kind of use more than a multiplier, but it's very similar. It is the same idea, but it is using different units in the numerator versus the denominator. So an example would be, maybe you don't want to know total jobs per direct job, but rather you're interested in the total jobs supported per dollar of government spending. So there we've got jobs per dollar. And so that is something we term more response coefficient. Another example would be tax revenue generated per job. So there you've kind of got them flipped. Now you have a dollar value per job value. And those can be calculated after running an impact analysis in InPlan. So you can get those from InPlan as well, no problem. Okay, now we get to some important considerations. A bigger industry does not always mean a bigger multiplier. Multipliers are influenced by many things, and chiefly among those, the RPCs, which means the regional purchase coefficient of the industry's main inputs and its suppliers' main inputs. And regional purchase coefficient just basically means what's the percentage of local demand for this thing that can be supplied by local producers of that thing. So an example would be if the RPC for grain was 90%, that means that 90% of the local demand for grain can be met by local production of grain. Okay, so sometimes an RPC could be 0 for things that just are not produced in the region, and sometimes it can be up to 100% for maybe things like electricity and other things that other kind of services that are highly local. Okay, so if an industry buys a lot of inputs that aren't produced locally, all else equal, it's going to have a smaller multiplier, even if it's a big industry. If it can't acquire any of its inputs locally, it's not going to have much of an extra multiplier effect in the region. Another thing is wage rates of the industry and its main suppliers. So suppose that industry doesn't buy a lot of inputs locally, but it has really highly paid workers and a lot of workers. Then, and those workers live locally. Well, then it might have a little bit of a bigger multiplier effect due to the induced part of the multiplier, because those workers are out spending more money. And the input and labor intensity of the industry relative to its suppliers. So in some, and commuting rates, which I kind of already mentioned. If more of the workers live locally, then they're more likely to spend more locally and things like that. So as you can imagine, multipliers vary by region, they vary by sector, and they vary by year. Another kind of related concept is that a bigger geography generally, but not always, guarantees a bigger multiplier. It really depends on the industry. So larger regions generally have larger multipliers, and that's because they have higher RPCs for most goods and services, because it's a bigger region, which means there's just more industries, and therefore more things can be acquired locally. They also usually have lower commuting rates. If you think of a single county, there's probably a lot of workers that live outside that county and commute into that county. But if you look at a state as a whole, percentage-wise, there's probably fewer workers that commute from outside of the state into that state when you're comparing that commuting rate to the commuting rate of a county. Okay. However, like I mentioned, this isn't always the case, especially if a county is very concentrated in a given sector, or if it has a much higher wage rate than the rest of the state. So think maybe a very urban county in a mostly rural state. That county may have higher multipliers for some industries than the state as a whole. Okay. All right, some more important considerations. One is customized events. So in InPlan, and I'm going to show you this at the end of the presentation, you can go in and see tables of multipliers by industry. If you were to run an impact in InPlan and not customize it at all, you would just put in your 100 jobs or however many jobs and let InPlan estimate the associated labor income, the associated output, all of that associated with those jobs, and you ran the impact and you calculated your own multiplier looking at your results, your total impacts divided by your direct impacts, you're going to get a multiplier that matches exactly what's in the multipliers table in InPlan. But if you went and customized your event, so you put in your 100 jobs, InPlan estimated that with that there'd be $10 million worth of output, and you said, nope, I know how much revenue there's going to be associated with these 100 jobs, and it's $50 million in output. You have then customized your event, and so you have a different output amount and therefore different labor income and different amounts of input purchases and all of that, so that when InPlan spits out your impact results, you're going to divide your total impacts divided by your direct impacts, and you're going to have a multiplier that's specific to your firm that you analyzed, that is a little different than the industry as a whole, because you customized it. And so your multiplier is going to be different than what the industry multiplier displayed in InPlan is going to be. And that's okay. That's totally okay. It's just so that you know that if you're running a customized event and for some reason you want to report your multiplier as part of your report, then you'll want to do your own calculation of it, because your multiplier is going to differ than the industry-wide multiplier based on the more information you have about your specific company or specific event. Another thing to note is that in InPlan, the default setting is for household spending to be the only thing that creates induced effects. It's generally not recommended to internalize other institutions. Now, what does that jargon mean? It just basically means not to assume that other institutions like state and local government or federal government are going to spend more in the region associated with your impact, because that's very rarely the case. Government budgets are usually set far in advance and using other methods not specifically related to some construction activity that's happening in your state. There are a few exceptions and cases where it is justifiable to internalize state and local government. And we have an article that discusses this whole topic of internalizing other institutions, which just basically means counting their spending as part of induced effects. And it discusses the ramifications of internalizing all of the possible institutions and when it might be justified. And it really rarely is, and really is typically just for state and local government when you're using a state model, under some circumstances, depending on what you're analyzing. But there is an article on our support site, and you can just do a Google search for type SAM multiplier or internalize institutions, and it will come up, and you can read that if that's something that's of interest to you. Finally, before showing you the multipliers in InPlan, I just want to point out that there are summary multipliers and detailed multipliers, both in InPlan, and I'll show you how to find both of those. But a summary multiplier just basically is the total multiplier for an industry that sums up the secondary impacts that it has on all the other industries in that region. okay? Whereas detailed, you can look at that industry's impact on a very specific each of the specific other industries. So you can break it down industry by industry. And I will show you that next. So let me hop out of this presentation and I will pull over InPlan app and I'm going to click on regions and randomly pick a region. Let me see if I can get it to refresh. There we go. I probably had it sitting open a little too long. So since I live in Colorado, I'm going to just pick Colorado. You can see I'm looking at 2019 data, but of course you can pick whichever data year you are interested in. I'll just stick with 2019. And I'm going to click on this button here to view region details. And there's all kinds of things we can look at, but today we are just considering multipliers. So I'm going to click on multipliers here, and there you can see we can look at summary multipliers, and there are different multiplier types. We talked about output, employment, labor income, value added, and each of the 4 components of value added. So lots to look at here, and then the detail multipliers, which we'll look at next. So let's just start. Oh, and then here are some per million effects. That's what we were talking about, kind of a response coefficient, which is technically different than a multiplier, but it's the same concept. So let's look at summary employment multipliers. And there you'll see there is just one number per industry. So we'll just give it a moment to load. And there's a scatter plot up there if you're interested, but I'm going to hop right down to the table. And for each industry, you can see there's just one row. And it does break it down into the components of the multiplier. So the type 1 multiplier is just the direct and indirect impacts. And then you've got your induced multiplier. And then the type SAM multiplier is all of those together. That's the total multiplier is what we would call it. And you can see there's just one for each industry because this is the summary multiplier. Okay. You can scroll down here, you can sort it if you wanted to by clicking on each of these columns to see which are the highest and which are the lowest and all of that. Now, I'm going to just give you a quick preview of detailed multipliers. We'll look at employment again. And again, there's a scatter plot at the top, but I'm going to just scroll right down to the table. And here, in this case, you'll notice at the top here, I have to choose an industry because now I'm looking at, this is a detail multiplier. So it's saying what is oilseed farming's multiplier on the oilseed farming sector, and then on the grain farming sector, and then on the vegetable and melon farming sector. So if you summed all of these rows together, you would get that overall summary multiplier for oilseed farming of 4 point whatever it was, 4 point something. This is breaking it out into more detail. So all of these rows sum up to 4 point something. And of course, the multiplier for itself is the biggest because it's the only one that has that direct employment impact. So this is just showing if you wanted to say what is the main industries that oilseed farming impacts in a multiplier's way, you could sort through this and see which are the greatest and so on and so forth. So this has been just a little bit of a taste for you as to what multipliers are. I hope it's been helpful and I hope to see you in our next video. Thank you for watching.